Thank you all very much for coming. I'm Nick Stern, and I'm a professor here at the LSE. I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. Now, the first thing to do is to make sure that those in the back row can hear. Can you? Yeah. Very good, and you're capable of movement, so thank you. Thank you very much. It's a very special pleasure for me to introduce the two people on the platform tonight. Great friends, personally great friends of the LSE. Let me start by introducing Amartya Sen. It's the Amartya Sen lecture, and I thought I should start by introducing Amartya Sen just to make it very clear it's not the Amartya Sen Memorial Lecture. So, could you move a part of your anatomy? Yes. Amartya has been a friend of about 45 years. Our first Christmas in India, 1974, we spent with him in a Chinese restaurant in Calcutta. But of even greater distinction, he won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1998, the Bharat Ratna, Jewel of India, in 1999, and last year he was the first non-US recipient of the National Humanities Medal. Those are the awards and distinctions, but of course the great distinction is in his work, and which I'm sure many of you here, I won't try to summarise it all. Many countries own Amartya, or claim that they own Amartya. India, where he was born and whose passport he carries, Bangladesh, where he grew up in many ways, went to school, the UK, of course, United States, where he now works. We all claim him. Many universities claim Amartya, Presidency College in Calcutta, Oxford, where he was a professor, Cambridge, where he was Master of Trinity, Harvard, where he's now a professor. Very special years, though, at the schools of economics, for 10 years in the 60s to the early 70s at the Delhi School of Economics, and most importantly 1972 to 1977 when he was a professor of economics at the London School of Economics. And indeed over the last 2 decades he's been collaborating very fruitfully with a former researcher here, Jean Drez, and a number of books, and one which is about to appear. Now the lectures are in Amartya's name, and he is of very special significance in our subject, very special significance in economics, and it is one of those contributions that it's so difficult to do justice to, because if you picked one bit you might be irritating Amartya because you hadn't picked the other bit, and so I'm not going to pick any bit Amartya, and it's a tremendous range from the technical to the very human indeed, the political and so on. And it's wonderful for us to have the second Amartya Sen lecture at the LSE here. There have been 3 Amartya Sen lectures in Brussels before this one, but this is the second one at the London School of Economics. The first one was a great friend of the 3 of us, Joe Stiglitz, last year. We're very grateful to the support of Stickard and the Department of International Development here at the LSE, and to our friends at Trinity College, Cambridge, who have played a role in getting all these lectures going. And to Amy Marsden at the back for doing so much of the work to make this happen. Now, Jim, you hired me in 2000 to be the chief economist of the World Bank, and immediately got into a great deal of trouble. And I won't go through the causes of the trouble, but it was associated with hiring me. And the problem was that my brother was already working there, and there was a strict rule about not hiring brothers, which Jim told the board of the World Bank all about, but that's another story. But working with you, Jim, was one of the outstanding and rewarding experiences of my life. And Jim is going to tell us about his tenure. I was there for only 3 years. Jim is going to tell us about his 10 years at the World Bank, but much more than that. He's going to tell us about his reflections on a changing world, 1950 to 2050. Sir James, because he was knighted in 1995, KBE, but wasn't able to call himself Sir because we have very strict rules in this country that unless you're a citizen of the Commonwealth you can't call yourself Sir. But he regained his Australian citizenship to reprise one of his many great achievements, which was 1956. He fenced for Australia in the Olympics at Melbourne, and they had a rerun, so he decided he wasn't going to wear his Australian outfit until he'd acquired his Australian citizenship. But at that point, we had to start calling him Sir James. Enormously successful banker in London and New York, amateur cellist, chair of Carnegie Hall and the Kennedy Centre. Indeed, he was knighted for his services to the arts. So he was an outstanding leader in his profession, in his sport, and in culture, and all that before he went to the World Bank in 1995. In my view, and this is my view, there have been just two great presidents of the World Bank in its 70-year history, Robert McNamara and Jim Wolfensohn. Robert McNamara found his commitment to fighting poverty, which was indeed deep and sincere, after his involvement in the extraordinarily destructive Vietnam War. Jim's commitment was always there, and you made it absolutely central to the work of the bank. You deepened the understanding of what poverty meant, again an area of Amartya's to understand what it meant, but you took the understanding of the World Bank to a much deeper level, and above all, you showed how to deliver. Looking back, I think we'll see 1995 to 2005 as a very important period in fighting world poverty, and actually a period of some success. Success is never total in these areas, but a period of some success. So, Sir James, Jim, citizen of the world, friend, you're enormously welcome here at the LSE.
Thank you so much, Nick, and let me say how proud I am to be at the table with you, Lord Stern, and with you, Nobel Prize winner Amartya Sen. I feel outgunned, and I noticed that you did not talk about my academic achievements in the same way that you did about those of my friend Amartya. I find that a bit depressing, actually, because my record is equally illustrious, but a little unknown. I know I once tried to get to London School of Economics, but was advised that I probably shouldn't come here after my record, and so I had to go and study in the United States instead. And I'm sorry about that now as I look around and see so many wonderful young people in the audience and very distinguished looking professors who are looking at me with great concern about what I might do given my lack of academic background. I am thrilled to be here with Amartya. As I think you know, Rabindranath Tagore gave him his name. He knew already then that he was immortal, because that is the meaning of Amartya. And Emma also has another name, which means that she is beautiful, intelligent and caring, which is an Australian derivation of the name Emma. As to Nick, I don't know what you are, Nick, but I have to say you're a great friend and I appreciate being here. I've had the great privilege when I was at the World Bank of having some people to help me. One was Larry Summers, who went on to become Secretary of the Treasury. Joe Stiglitz, who was last here lecturing you, was chief economist from 1997 to 2000. And then, of course, Nick from 2000 to 2003. The only difference is that tonight I can't read their speech. And so I had to stay up rather late last night, looking to see what I would say to this audience, who already knows more about economics than I shall ever know. But I did take the opportunity to read again Development as Freedom, which is one of Amartya's many books, and I read through the introduction, in which I was hoping to find a nice reference to me, and he did describe something about my background. He was particularly anxious to point out that I was, for 23 years, head of the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton. That was a great job for me because I never understood anything that they said, but I would chair the dinners and look intelligent, and it was a wonderful task. But then I went on, since Amartya had done 6 lectures for us at the bank, I then found out something else that he said. He said, the World Bank has not invariably been my favorite organization. The power to do good goes almost always with the possibility to do the opposite. And as a professional economist, I had occasion in the past to wonder whether the bank could not have done very much better. I didn't know you thought that about us, Amartya, but anyway, you were very welcome at the time. And I also was happy that when you put out your book, Development as Freedom, that you picked up a number of my ideas to talk about the 5 freedoms, which interestingly were exactly what I...
Acknowledge.
What's that?
Acknowledge.
I don't think you acknowledge it. The only reference was to how little he thought of what I was intellectually. But he did talk about political freedoms and economic facilities and freedom of economic security, social opportunities. I think you know all this. And he did mention corruption and protective security. And I have to tell you that I stayed up till 4 o'clock this morning wishing that I had read this book before I had taken the task of running the bank. And I suggest to you that if you're going to get into public service, you must read that book, but not at 4 a.m. And it was and is a remarkable book. And I have had the chance, I'm happy to say, to read it before. But the thing that it did is it is such a human approach to development. We get used to thinking about how many people have just dropped off the list of extreme poverty, how many people live under $2.50 and how many live under $1.25 a day. And it's as though for many people that is the yardstick of how successful you are in development. And of course, if you're in the business, you recognize that doesn't mean a hell of a lot. And I'm very happy to say that the gentlemen on both sides of me tonight, as well as Joe Stiglitz, who was here at your last meeting, were very, very clear on what I learned about the business, which is that poverty is a multifaceted activity. And indeed, to look at it, you need to look well beyond just the issue of how much you earn. And you need, when you're president of the World Bank, also to create an environment in which your objective is not just to meet the numerical target, but indeed to create the opportunity for people who live in poverty to have an opportunity to broaden their lives, and to do the sort of things which Amartya talks about so clearly in his book. We saw during my period at the bank quite a lot happening in the period between 1950 and 2000. You probably know that the G7 plus Canada came together in 1975. That in 1997 Russia was added, so that it became the G8. In 2003, there was a very interesting meeting held by Jacques Chirac, chairing it in Canada. And no, it wasn't. It was in France. It was just across the Lake Léman. And I remember we went over there, and for the first time, the G8 invited some of the unwashed people whom we were trying to help, and they were each given 12 minutes to speak. There were 10 presidents of developing countries, and in order they spoke. As I recall, the first one was President Hu of China, who spoke movingly about what had happened in China, and then President Bajpai from India, I know he spoke for 12 minutes, but I regret to say I didn't understand a word, Amartya. But I know it was impressive. And then President Lula, who was the newly installed president of Brazil, and he said what I feel tonight, that my parents would be very proud if they thought I was making a speech in this context. He said how proud he was to be there in the presence of all these great leaders. And then he suggested, why don't you next year come and have your meeting in Brazil? Because that'll get you used to having meetings in Brazil. Because in a decade's time, 3 or 4 of you will not be here. You will be replaced by Brazil, Russia, India, China, and you might as well get used to coming and meeting in a developing country. It was said as a joke. The people from the more developed world didn't laugh very much, but they did note that he had made that intervention. And of course, it is correct that what has happened since then is that we have a much broader sharing of global leadership. Indeed, that mutated into a G20, which has now replaced the G8 in terms of a representative body where the issues of the 80% in terms of income of the world are discussed. And then there is another group, as you know, the G77, which are the less fortunate countries, which I might add now has become the G131, with 131 members being there to discuss the role of the other 20% of the world income. And this is the way the current breakdown is of at least the official institution that is representing the countries of the world. But what is happening is really much deeper than that. And let me just comment on some of the things that I saw during my period at the bank, because they may interest you, because they affected me very much. In particular, the first thing that you became a question, especially if you're at the World Bank, was the issue of what was happening in Africa. When I took the job at the bank, there were 4 countries that had initially been given their freedom or taken their freedom, and that was Liberia, South Africa, Egypt, and Ethiopia. Just before I came, I should say that after that, in the 50s, Libya and Sudan and Morocco came in. And by the time I was starting, there was some move to have freedom and recognition of the rights to govern yourself to the other countries, and within pretty short order, we had 53 countries that were independent in the continent of Africa. It was quite interesting to me because one of the countries was Nigeria, which was given freedom in 1960, given its right to independence. And I remember I was so moved by it in my first job for an American company, I convinced my boss that I should go down to Nigeria, and because this was a great and important country in Africa, and that it was about time that American companies recognized what was happening, and that I would go down there and I would establish a foothold for my company that I was then working for. Well, I went there, and there were still the flags up for independence, and I remember going into the Parliament House, and I was so impressed by Africans wearing full-bottomed wigs and everything that you have in Westminster that I decided to take some pictures with little minox that my wife had given me, until about 15 minutes later a policeman came up and tapped me on the shoulder to leave, and I was quite sure that that was then to go to the meeting with the minister that I had, until I found his arm holding my arm rather firmly as we walked outside. And then there were people outside the Parliament House calling out, "Spy, spy, spy." And I said, "Is there a spy there?" He said, "Yes, you, sir." And he took me along to the office of the Leader of Opposition, where the door clicked shut, and the policeman was outside. And I thought, for my first trip for my American company, it'd be wonderful to go back in chains, or to have the New York Times say that a representative of the country was arrested today in Nigeria. And so I decided that the only thing to do, since it was a terrible mistake, was to open the door and run by and see if I could find someone in authority. Well, I did that, now pursued by my policeman, and the person had gone, and I saw a room marked prayer room. So I rushed into the prayer room, and there was a Muslim member of the Nigerian parliament washing his feet, getting ready to pray. And he said, "What on earth are you doing here?" in a perfect Oxford accent. I said, "I'm looking for asylum." So he said to me, "Calm down, young man, calm down." So I told him the story, and he took me then to the office of the leader of the opposition. I was still pretty shaken, at which time an Irish head of security came along, picked me up and took me down to the police station. And he told me I had one call to make. And this reminded me of a very bad movie, but anyway, I called the person that I was going to see that night, who was the Chief Justice of the Western Region. So I got him on the phone, and he said, "Oh, yes, I'm very anxious to see you tonight." I said, "Well, sir, I'm very anxious to see you too, but I have a problem." And he said, "What's that?" I said, "I'm arrested." And anyway, to cut a long story short, he got me out. But the next day, there were headlines about this white spy, aged 50, who was there. And that was my first experience of Africa. And it didn't stop me going back to Africa, but it nearly stopped me going back. And every time after that, when I went down there, I would get from Obasanjo a letter saying that I was his friend and that I was not a spy. And I say that only to tell you that Africa's come a long way since then. But in those days, it was hugely sensitive about everything. And although there are 170 million people there, which is not a trivial country, it was one that was seriously growing up, and there was a certain inbuilt uncertainty about Europeans, particularly. And so I almost gave up my interest in Africa, but not so much that it didn't allow me, when I was at the World Bank, to recognize that Africa was for us to be the central challenge, really, of what we were doing. Nick knows it well or better than I did. And I had the opportunity thereafter of going frequently to Africa and see the enormous developments that have taken place in that continent. But they're developments that I think we can't yet claim victory in what has happened in the continent, and I'll get back to that in just a minute. I recollect that on my first trip to Africa, which I took to be the major challenge I had, I went to Malawi, and I went to Mali, I went to South Africa, happily on the day of the Springbok game against South Africa for the World Cup, which was an amazing experience, to the Côte d'Ivoire, to Uganda. And again, I was influenced particularly by the great split that there was between the very poor and the very rich. And unfortunately, when I went to Malawi and stayed at the presidential palace, it became very clear on what you could do if you were very rich. And indeed, it was set up with the sort of opulence that you could only dream of if you wanted to be that opulent. But it presented a challenge to me that when I got to the World Bank, I recognized was to be central to the work that we were doing in that period before the year 2000, and indeed in the period afterwards. And I have to say that as I look back on the period before the year 2000, there were a number of things that I thought were critical. The first thing was that when I got to the bank in 1995, I immediately took a look at Africa, and indeed went to Africa 5 days after my appointment was confirmed, and I'd entered the bank. I should tell you in those days that the bank was pretty resistant to amateurs like me, and that they'd had a series of presidents who, since Bob McNamara, had been more token leaders than I think I can say than active in their activities, all very good people, but not terribly much getting their hands dirty. And the bank was totally controlled by, if I may say so, by a group of some Americans, but mainly Pakistanis and Indians, who were the heads of the regions. There were no meetings of the bank itself. On Friday, these people would get together and would have a discussion over lunch about what was happening. But each one had his own bank, and that was not, I think, ideal. But it made me a bit of a problem when I came to the bank, because they were quite used to having a chairman who was not going to get engaged in the reconstruction and the reorganization of the institution. And so my first challenge at the bank was to try and see if one could make it into an institution that had a leader, however good or bad he was, and some organization to bring it together institutionally. And that was the challenge that I had to face in 1995, and it was pretty tough, because I would come back and I would try to make jokes, as I've tried here, and there wouldn't be a single laugh. And I would find out from my friends in the press that this week there were only a dozen letters complaining about me, only 6 letters complaining about me. But there was a strong institutional reaction to any degree of change. And then what I discovered was that the best place to go were the people under 25. It was a group that had never been spoken to. And then when I expanded it to the group under 35, I found that they'd never been spoken to either. So I was able, as I look around this room, to appeal to a much younger audience and say, if you want to change this place, stick with me. And so we did change the institution, and we made it an institution which was then one of sharing responsibility, of bringing it to a very different level, because in the days when I got there, the leaders of each region of the world would visit the regions, but they would never think of living there. And the decision makers were all in New York, in Washington. And the meetings each year to decide on what happened in these countries where we were lending money or doing projects were all held either in Washington or in Paris. And I then thought that if it is a World Bank, why don't we move people to the field? And why don't we have the meetings in the field, so that you could have not just the chosen representatives, but that you could actually get a feel of the country. You could meet with civil society, you could meet with government, you could expose yourself to criticisms, you could engage the society. And so we started doing that, and that, I might add, was something that so many of the other investment banks then started doing. Because development is not something that can be imposed from the outside. If that's what happens in development, it's not going to work. What you must do is to reflect the best thinking inside the society. Of course, adding whatever commentary you have on your own experience, but to develop a real action in terms of development in the developing world, you must engage the people in those countries. And you can't look at them as some pawn on a chessboard that you're playing with. You must engage the society. And so we started doing that, and the other investment banks, I might add, the regional banks, all started to do the same. And so instead of the central bank, instead of the regional banks and the bank ourselves, and the same was true of the International Monetary Fund, instead of us sitting in Washington or sitting in Paris or sitting in the capitals, we went out. And the first lesson that I realized was that if you're going to be in development at all, and you're going to bring about change, you must do it inside the society that you're dealing with. You cannot, as a colonial master, come in from the outside and try and bring about change. And so this is something that we then sought to do as a first major move in terms of the bank itself. The second thing that we sought to do, which was, I think, of great importance, and which was obviously at the core of Amartya's own writing, was to recognize that if you're going to try and bring about change in a society, first of all, it's not done by the stroke of the pen. It's no simple thing. That it is a complex activity, that you must engage yourself in a whole host of activities that you can't deal with overnight, but where you need to try and get the people focused on change which comes over a period of years. And what you don't want to do is to have it constantly changed by a changing government. You need to establish something which can be a plan for that country and which has the possibility of enduring. And while I didn't copy what I was doing from Amartya or anybody else, what I did try and do was to set up two things first. The first was to try and deal with the issue of the outstanding debt. One of the things I came to realize after a couple of years is that we would make loans of 15 billion or 16 billion or 14 billion, and I would look at the end of the year when they gave me the annual report to see my 16 billion adding to the balance sheet. And every year the balance sheet was a billion or so up or down. The 16 billion was never there. And I wondered how you could be adding 16 billion in terms of your assets and the balance sheet would change a billion either way. Of course, the answer was that you were getting repaid 15 billion, or sometimes you get repaid 17 billion. And so the balance sheet never really changed very much. I took out, but don't have the time to give it to you today, but I took out the last sort of 20 years of the balance sheets of the bank group, and if you just take my word for it, it really barely changed each year. We started, when I started with sort of 184 billion, 206, and by the time I got there, 207, 217, 221, 224, 217, 218. It was all around the same level. And I then went to the shareholders and said, this is being caused by the enormous debt that there is. What is changing these figures is that we are claiming back debts all the time, and the money that we're giving them can only be used essentially to repay us. And if you really want something to be done, we have to get rid of this debt load. And that took a little convincing, but in fact in the end we retired $76 billion worth of debt, and then shortly after that there was another program, and in total $113 billion worth of debt was written off in Africa. $113 billion. That is a very substantial amount. And then that allowed the money that we would give to be used for something constructive. And we made sure that it was then put into the sort of programs of health and education and development of the people that could then be used. And so we would have 2-3% every year of the GDP going into constructive purposes instead of being round trip to us. And that has brought about a significant change, except that very sadly we're now seeing again a misuse of some of these funds. And that brought us to the other issue, which you then quickly become aware of, which is the issue of corruption. I'm not directing the corruption issue solely in Africa. The corruption issue is a global issue. And so in my second speech, I decided to make a speech in the annual meeting about the cancer of corruption, what this was doing to the development business. And I gave a draft of my speech, as I had to the General Counsel. And instead of him coming into my office and saying, Jim, I want to make some comments, he came into my office and said, Mr. President, which he never called me, I'd like to see you outside my office. And I said, well, this is perfectly comfortable here, Ibrahim. Why don't we just have it here? He said, no, I've got to see you outside. So he walks outside of my office into a sort of, or not an auditorium, but an amphitheater sort of thing. And he took me behind a pillar and he said to me, Mr. President, I've read your speech. You cannot use the C word. And I said, Ibrahim, what the hell is the C word? And he then quietly whispered to me, corruption. And I said, Ibrahim, why can't I talk about corruption? He said, well, I don't know whether you know this, but on your board, at least half the shareholders represent corrupt governments. And you cannot embarrass them. And I said, well, I don't want to embarrass them, but how can we run an institution if we know that the money's going to be stolen? And he said, well, it always has been that way, since Bob McNamara. And Bob never made a speech about the C word. So, of course, I went and made a speech about the C word and talked about it. 6 months later, every director of the bank talked about corruption and how it didn't apply to them, which was a good start. But I regret to say that it's only a start, because the level of corruption today is a very heavy burden. Now, on just about every project that I looked at in my 10 years in office, I would make an assumption that there was a discount of 15 or 20% on whatever money we put in, because it would be taken. I took a further discount in terms of an ineffective use of that money, with a lot of overheads and a lot of people working on it. And so for every dollar that you put in, you started with the assumption, or I did, at best you would get 60% of the money that you were putting out going into the project itself. Now those numbers may have changed today, but I can tell you in those days, working on the ground, it was a pretty decent assumption to make. And so the issue of development and the issue of trying to help countries is very seriously involved in the issue of legality, corruption, and what is the take that people are getting locally. It's not a very happy subject to talk about, but it is a very real subject. And so what we did further was to not only try and take account of the corruption issue, but also try and take account of trying to set out what your program was going to be, and not just instant results, but over a period of time. And we introduced a thing called the Comprehensive Development Framework, which, looking at the time, I don't have time to get into, but very simply, what it wasn't being copied from Amartya, but it's very similar from what Amartya was talking about, in that development is not just something simple, it is complex. And so we started by saying there is a great importance in governance, there's a great importance in setting up a representative body, there's a great importance in having integrity with the government. It then went on to talk about education and health, it went on to talk about infrastructure, and then do a number of other things. There were 14 headings that we looked at. And to my surprise, some 13 countries in the days that I was there were taking this idea of trying to come up not just with a gift to the country, but coming up with a program that would be done over time, and which would be done by discussions inside the country. And it led to what I think was, particularly in the case of some Latin American countries that were very, very anxious to try and see this done in Latin America, try and see if you could come up with programs that were not annually approved in terms of just 1 year, but were annually approved in terms of a decadal view of where the country was going. I might add that that is the sort of thing that is being done in China, with the 5-year reviews that are being done there, and where at least in terms of 5-year terms, they're trying to look out in terms of trying to establish a longer-term program broken down into these 5-year modules. And so it was that we changed, not inconsiderably, the way in which this was being looked at, until we came to the year 2000. I might tell you that until the year 2000, 80% of the global GDP, 80%, was with the OECD countries. And that was, at the year 2000, the billion people that lived in the so-called rich countries. The other 5 billion people, which lived in the developing countries, which included China and India, were getting 20%. So the breakdown was very uneven, and it had been like that for 30 years. A sort of 80-20 split, with the OECD countries having 80% of the global income, and the other 100 and whatever it was countries having 20%. But that was stability in the year 2000. And in terms of the control of the institutions themselves, that's the way the leadership was spread. You had an American at the World Bank, you had a European at the International Monetary Fund, and if you looked at the key positions that were being held in the international institutions, that is where the power was distributed. although in some of the regional banks, certainly the Asian Bank was headed by a Japanese, but the Japanese were a big contributor. But it was no doubt in the way in which the institutional framework was created that everybody was conscious of this 80-20 situation. That started to change in the year 2000. And it first started to change with, instead of 80-20, it was 75-25 and gradually going down. And what now we are anticipating by 2050 is that the 80-20 that we had will be 35-65. The 80%, namely the OECD countries, will have 35% of the global income, and the other 65% will be non-OECD countries that will have the 65% of global income. That is a huge change. It will bring also big changes in the way in which the international institution works. And if you read yesterday's newspaper and you saw the agenda for the forthcoming meeting between the President of the United States and the President of China, where they're going away for 2 days together, one of the items on the agenda is going to be the leadership of international institutions, not surprisingly. And I see it myself in the quality of people and the way things are changing in the international institutions, not just the World Bank, but certainly with the IMF. And with Christine Lagarde, who is doing a remarkable job. Now, for 3 years, she has been trying to change the percentage ownership of the IFC to make China number 3 and to put 3 of the developing countries in the top 10 voting shareholders. The change is coming, but it is very much still resisted by the big Western countries. But this change is hugely important in terms of the way in which our global institutional framework is running. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I'm happy to just comment on, although it seems irrelevant here in the presence of Nick, is that the climate is changing. And the intrusion of Nick Stern into the international arena of subjects has become quite an issue. The Stern report, of course, warned us that our environment was changing and that this was something that was not national, this was international. And he talked, as you know, what was then pretty modest changes, 3-4%, in terms of global temperature. Most recently, I've got a quote from him somewhere here, most recently, as we have seen the results of current reviews, we reached a point where we had 400 parts per mil of CO2 recently announced, and it has caused Lord Stern, I think, to reassess the likely risks, even though, as I've discovered in my recent research, there are many, many experts who think that he doesn't have it right. But I'm quite convinced that A, he has it right, but B, if it's marginal, we can't take a risk on it, in any event. And we must get to dealing with this question, and I'm just proud to have him as a friend and thrilled that he is advocating something which for me seems very obvious, which is that this issue is a global issue, which requires the sort of attention that he's calling for, and that we'd better get on with it and try and deal with it. And I'm just hopeful that even though he will have new responsibilities in his country as, what is it?
The President of the British Academy.
President of the British Academy. I was calling him the Royal Society, and I'm sure that's not right. But I know he has a great office, which I hope to visit him in, not too far from here. And that at least for 4 years I can be assured of a good lunch when I come to London. And having Nick there is truly a wonderful thing for this country. I just hope that he continues on his international activities in terms of the temperature and the global issues that are so important and for which he's such a remarkable spokesman. And So the temperature issue, the global issues, were now intruding themselves in a way that national issues, of course, individually do not. But it is the first of those issues, and the impact of climate change, as I think you all know, is very considerable. I was going to talk about the change in income levels, but I've touched on it already. And what time am I supposed to finish? Now, is it?
Well, can you give it another 5 minutes, Jim?
5 minutes.
Yeah.
I will stop. I have another half hour's work here, but I will. The rest of it actually shows how clever I am. So you're just going to have to go away not knowing. But what does come out in the other materials is that the weight of economic leadership is shifting, has shifted, will continue to shift to the developing countries. And as I look at the 2050 statistics, I find that in terms of the non-adjusted GDPs, it starts with China, United States may be number 2, then India, Japan, Germany, UK, but then in the top 20, Brazil, Mexico, France gets in, Italy, Turkey, South Korea, Spain, Russia, the Philippines, Indonesia, Australia sneaks in, Argentina, Egypt, and then as you go on, Malaysia, Thailand, Poland, Peru, Iran, Colombia, Switzerland, Pakistan. Those were not the listings that I would have had when I was at university, nor would my parents have thought that I should go study in a developing country. I was trying to get to the developing country of Japan, which wasn't such a developing country when I was leaving Australia, but there was no scholarship available, so I had to go to Harvard instead. But Harvard doesn't know that it was number 2 choice. But if you look now at the way in which the world is preparing for this, the fascinating thing is that the West is not preparing for it. If you look at China, for example, this year, they'll have 200,000 students coming to study in the United States. 200,000, the largest ever. Total of 350,000 in all going abroad. We will have 11,000 students from America going to China. The Indians will have 100,000 students coming to study in the United States. We will have 4,100 to study in India. The truth is that people 40, 50, 60 just don't recognize this change. So when their kids come to them and say, Dad, I'd really like some help to go study in Italy or France or occasionally Brazil or wherever it is, or England or one of those countries, that they understand. But if you talk about going to India or to China or to an Asian country or even a relatively poor country in Africa, you don't have a chance of getting support. These are the issues which I hope all of you recognize. Because for you, the future is in the developing world. And you have to understand it. And I don't know what they teach at LSE. I'm sure they're well ahead of this issue. And this is common knowledge. And I'm sure the agenda and the teaching has changed to direct you to this changing global pattern. I'm certain of that. But just in case it hasn't, you really need to press for it, because that is your future. That is where the 65% of the global GDP will be. The 35% will be where I grew up thinking it was, which is with 80% of the places that are essentially in the West, plus Japan. And if I can leave you with anything, since I have exactly 1 minute and a half left, it is to say to you that in my experience and in my time working in this international field, the first thing was to deal with the extremities of the claims on trying to get some change. And so I worked in Africa, and even today, I'll come back to it in just a second, Africa will now have 20% of the world's GDP. 20%. It'll be 1.8 to $2 billion, trillion dollars. And that'll be 20% of the global GDP. And I might add, there's still a huge need for development in Africa, because the per capita income, even with that, will be between somewhere between $4,000 and $5,000 per capita in the year 2050. When in India it's probably 20,000, and in China it's probably over 30,000. So there's a huge gap that you need to face in Africa. And the United States and the rich countries will be sort of 80, 90, $100,000 per capita. So the world is building up to this enormous differential in terms of income. And if I had more time, I would talk to you also about the changes that are needed in infrastructure and what is needed to try and bring these countries along, and it's not there easily available. But it is a whole subject that you will need to confront. And you will need to confront it because, A, it will be where the work is being done, and secondly, you'll be fighting for stability on the planet. You'll be fighting for a world that is a little more peaceful. And I might add, you'll be fighting for individual resources like water, which, as I'm sure you know from work here at LSE, will come under great stress in the period 2025-2030. There's so much of the world will be lacking water, and there'll be so many people that don't have water. And it'll bring about shifts in migration and shifts in the way in which countries develop. So you will have water, you'll have 2 billion people coming up that are not as well off as in other places. You'll still have dollar poverty, but if you read Amartya's book, you will find that there is that form of poverty still in many parts of the world. And you'll find that those countries are seeking to educate themselves more, as I've shown you, about the new world than we are. And I quoted the statistics for China and India. So we're going into this next 40 years, in my judgment, not as well prepared as we might be, not as conscious as we should be of what is going to happen in the world, not as conscious as we should be of the new challenges. And so I'm very happy to have the opportunity to come here at Nick's invitation and to see, as I look around the room, so many faces that are more intelligent than Nick's and mine, and dare I say, I won't say that about you, Amartya. You're too clever. But I mean, for Nick and myself, or at least for myself, I'm very, very happy to see that this group is here and that you're going to deal with the challenges that I've quickly outlined and which I am certain you will be capable of resolving. Thank you very much.
Jim, thank you so much. The changes that Jim described in the World Bank in terms of putting the country in the driver's seat, taking a long-term view, dealing with debt, dealing with governance and corruption issues, putting it all together in a way that development action could really get results on scale. Might sound obvious from here, but they constituted a period of remarkable change in the World Bank that led many changes in the way in which people understand and see policy. And it takes somebody with Jim's experience of the world and his long-term perspective to help us look ahead and to see how radically the world is changing and to pose the real challenge as to whether we in the rich countries have really understood that anywhere near fast enough or the scale. So, Jim, thank you so much for that. Now we've got about 25 minutes for questions and answers. Amartya Sen will participate in that questioning and answering. Maybe he'll do questions and answers. We'll see. But what we'd like to do is open up the floor now, and you could put questions to the platform. Ideally not to me, but to Jim and Amartya. If I can't restrain myself, I won't, but I'll try not to. And to give you as much time as possible. So if you could give your name and keep the questions as short as possible. Indeed, not short as possible, keep the questions short. Gentleman there at the back.
Hello, I'm Rav. I'm a development student here at LSE. There's a lot of debate at the moment about what will replace the Millennium Development Goals. And so James, you were at the bank during the time the goals were being put together. And there's a lot of debate about how our definitions of deprivation and poverty need to be broadened. People are talking about goals for empowerment, goals for gender equality, goals for environmental sustainability. So you were there when the original ones put together. Professor Sen, you've obviously done a tremendous amount to broaden our ideas of deprivation. So I was wondering if I could pin you both down to maybe one or two additional dimensions that you think a future set of post-MDGs ought to consider in addition to the things they currently consider, what perhaps the most important ones might be.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to take three at a time. Anyone from upstairs there? The lady right at the back.
Hi there, my name is Melissa Carson. My question is probably mostly to Professor Sen. What are the one or...
Right at the top at the back. Right at the top of the back.
Disembodied questions are very nervous making, yeah.
Easier to put a face to it. What are the one or two biggest theoretical questions you're working on? For example, I know in the development community, one of the big issues is the amass of wealth and how power influences the decisions that we make. How could you articulate what are the two or three biggest questions you think there are for us of that nature?
Thank you. One more and then we'll go gentleman over there.
Hi, I'm Abir. I'm a master's student in post-war recovery studies at York University. I was hoping to get your views on the changes currently going on in the Arab world with the Arab Spring, and in terms of with the economic changes that might take place. Do you see there being any tension, perhaps, if there does end up being demands for a democratic voice? And if there is that democratic voice, will there be any tension between putting through any economic reforms that may be needed?
Thank you very much. They're all big questions, so the answers will obviously have to be short in order to allow one or two more rounds of questions. So what to do to replace the MDGs, the big theoretical challenges of our time, including wealth and power, and changes in the Arab world. Jim, do you want to start?
Well, let me start backwards. I think you may or may not know that I spent a year or so working on the issue of Israel-Palestine as the quartet envoy, and had a chance in that capacity, and also before that to travel when I was at the bank very broadly in the Arab world, and I'd go when I was at the bank twice a year to the Middle East, and I think went to just about every country and made a lot of friends. So I say this with a feeling of great friendship to many of the leaders in the Middle East. But I have to say that my big worry in the Middle East is that with the changing dynamic in terms of youth and in terms of unemployment, which we saw very visibly disposed in the Egyptian uprising, where I was fascinated to see that as you interviewed the people in the streets, there wasn't a single mention of Israel. It was all about jobs. It was all about getting a future. And that I would have to say as an outside friend, but not a commentator, that if I were in the region, I would be very concerned about the uneven distribution of opportunities and wealth. And with the new weapon of internet connection, which links the young people in the Middle East instantly with what is going on, beyond nationality, that I would be very concerned about the period within the next 10 to 15 years, about the current national order that exists in the Middle East. I say that with friendship, and I say that with a great degree of humility. But in terms of my experience, it would lead me to think that it's a big problem, a big issue in today's world. So that's what I would say about the Arab Spring. I don't think it is just an issue between the two sects of Islam. I think that is an issue that's playing out in that way. But I think the broader issue is youth and lack of jobs. And that's certainly what I found in the region. With regard to wealth, that is clearly something that Professor Sen can talk about more than I can, given his salary as a professor, and the fact that I'm not working in it, which is even worse. And in relation to a new
Instead
goal,
of being 6 times my salary, it become merely twice.
I don't work at all. That's why I came. Now, March I came here hoping for a fee, but I only learned just before I came in that Nick's not going to pay me. And that's why you got speech number 3. You didn't get my best speech. I'm selling that somewhere else, actually. If you're interested, you can hear it at Oxford tomorrow. It'll be reported in the press, I hope. You get some idea of what I think. On the new goals for development, I have to say just this, that I think that they were very useful, the past goals. But as you dig into them, they, I think, were inadequate in relation to their simplicity. I think if you read Development as Freedom, you will recognize that there are multiple objectives that are outlined by Amartya, actually, in the book. And so these simple, for me, the simple numerical targets might be useful, but you need to handle them with great care in terms of seeing whether you are succeeding or not. And I would be personally a little reluctant to set up targets again of reducing something by X% is going to make a huge difference. I think if you look at the arguments of Professor Sen in terms of the issues that he draws out, they're too complex, I think, to be hit by one single objective. And so it'd be my hope that it's not going to happen because people are already arguing about what the objectives should be, but I think they can be useful in focusing something, but I think that we should give everybody this book, Development as Freedom. And perhaps one of the objectives should be that everybody reads that book. That'd be a rather nice objective, to get the leaders of every country to read the book and pass a test on it. And if we have that, I think it'll make a difference.
Thank you. Amartya.
Well, it's a fascinating question, but given time quickly, I think that it's not so much, I don't think you're looking for definition of development, but characterization of it. What are the things to look at? I think, and one way of fixing the mind is exactly what you suggested as the MDGs, the Millennium Development Goal period, comes to an end in 2015. Which way should we go? I think an interesting clue is that the preceding the Millennium Development Goal, there was something that the United Nations passed called the Millennium Declaration. And it was similarly inspiring and direction-setting declaration as the 1948 Declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, but the United Nations did pass it. unanimously. Now, in the Millennium Development Goals, there are things like democracy, human rights, uh, issues of equity in itself. And you see, these are not very easy to measure. What happened with the Millennium Development Goals, these are the ones which are immediately quantifiable. Now, the quantifiable is a complex notion, and since I have some interest in the analytics of it, and next year I'm teaching a course with our professor of mathematics, Barry Mazer, and a friend, another friend, namely Eric Maskin, on the nature of mathematical reasoning. A quantification isn't really what we take it to be. It doesn't have to be 23, 47. Basically, it's concerned with ranking. And of course, in all these matters, you can do, human rights are being more violated now than in the past. These are pure ranking. And this is some way quantification then comes real order, a real value representation, and so forth. So I think we lost something in the Millennium Development Goals, moving from the Millennium Declaration. And I would be very strongly arguing for broadening it up again. And in that, even the 1948 Declaration, which I referred to, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, could play a big part. So that's the direction I would try to influence you if you are willing to be influenced. I think I'll probably suggest that. On the subject of one or two big ideas that broadening that we ought to do, I think the question came up. I'm not sure which question came from where. I think I'm looking at the wrong direction when I'm answering the question. But
the lady right at the top who asked about the big theoretical issues and wealth and power.
Yeah, I know. So what was your question? The MDG. Okay. All right. So I've done you, as it were. Now, on the subject of one or two great ideas, I think first of all we shouldn't say one or two great ideas, because there are many, many things we ought to do, and it's always a mistake to say. I mean, when I landed in Bombay and a newspaper said, if there are 3 things you wanted to do in India, what would you like to do? So I had to say, why 3 things? Why I can't do 135 things that I want to do in India? And that's really what happens when people say, this is important, really, this matters, and nothing else matters. That's the real difficulty in the perspective. That does matter, but there's so many other things that matter too. And I think the examples, for example, you gave about power. I think someone talked about power. I think it's important. It's a complex issue, and I think one of the clues is a remark that Anourin Bevan made, which Michael Foot played up very much in his biography, where Bevan said, the point of having power is to give it away. Now, it sounds very contrary, but of course what it really means that if you have the power to give it away, that means somebody else doesn't have that power over you. It's the denial of other people having the power. It's the kind of thing that you find across the world. I was looking the other day at Steve Biko's statement. A lot of them are just concerned about that, not having power over the others. That's not what the Black Power movement would be, but it would be not allowing others to have that kind of power on you. I think that's a very, very important idea to pursue in the context of development. Now, quickly, since Nick is about to cut me off, on the Arab world, I would say that it's an issue. Jim has already answered a part of the question very, very clearly. But I'd say that part of it is not so much the question of how to change the Arab world, but also what from its past to carry over. That's really a very important issue. Because I think we are creatures that, we live in the present. The present is a very fleeting moment of time. It passes even as we speak. What I said a minute ago is in the past. And they continue to influence us. Now, I think the reading in the Arab world has increasingly become now. I mean, when you think about, take somebody like Al-Khwarizmi, a mathematician, 9th century, definitely Muslim. On the other hand, what we're celebrating is maths also. There's no contradiction between them. He's Al-Khwarizmi is the guy you might or might not know from whose name the word algorithm comes, and from his book Al-Jabr Muqabila, the word algebra comes. So 9th century, he's getting on to those issues. These are part of the Arab heritage too. Now, if one just simply celebrates the religious part of the heritage and then goes into the distinctions between Shia, Sunni, and Sufi and others, I think you're making it more and more now. There's a very broad Arab culture which dominated the world. I mean, there were things that were moving from one part of the world to the other through the Arabs. For example, if you take a word like sign, the first use of it is Aryabhata in India, around 401 AD. He calls it Jia. The Arabs call it Jiba. Since Arabic, like Hebrew, has no vowel, it's written as consonant, JB. The later generation of Arab mathematicians call it Jabe, because Jiba is a completely meaningless word, but Jabe has a clear meaning, namely a cove or a bay. And when in 1150 Gerardo of Cremona translates that into Latin, he translates Jabe into sinus, meaning a lake and cove in Latin, and that of course becomes the word sign. So in that one word, you see a cross-cultural interaction, which is really extraordinarily important. And Arabs are not only, first of all, they're very creative in terms of maths and many other things, sciences, architecture, and so on. At the same time, they're also, they're preserving Greek thoughts. Aristotle and Plato would remember for a long time when the original records had vanished to the Arabic version. Similarly, Indian mathematics goes to Italy and Europe to there. And similarly, the other way around. So I think that's the enormous heritage that I look for. It's not a question of change. It's a question of remembering the past fully rather than very partially. So that's where I would draw my attention to.
Thank you, Amartya. Now I'm going to take two questions very quickly. Robert Wade down here and the lady in the front row there, and then we'll have to stop. And I'm sorry to all of you who haven't been able to ask a question. Afterwards, the lady in the right in the front here, please. Yeah. You. Please.
Robert Wade, I want to ask a question about the governance of the bank. If you were still the president, what would you advise the governments of the borrowing countries to do in order to break the American monopoly on the presidency of the World Bank? What concrete steps do you think the borrowing governments should be doing?
And this lady here.
I'm Kriti Trehan. I'm doing public international law at the LSE. I know Professor Sen has spoken about human rights and development, and my question is with regards to that, especially in light of something like economic sanctions that are in place over various parts of the world. How do you harmonize the concept of the human right to development itself in such a scenario where Sir James also spoke of the concept of corruption and how there's only a certain amount of persons who have the power in a certain nation, and sanctions tend to focus on those people.
And the question?
The question is, how would you harmonize the idea of the human rights to development in a sanctions scenario?
Thank you very much. I think perhaps, Jim, one for you and one for Amartya, given I know that you could both reply on both. But
Great. No, I think one each is great. I think...
Two for the price of one would be great too.
On the issue of governance of the bank, I think it should change and it will change. The governance of both the bank and the fund were determined in that 80-20 period. And that's a period in which the OECD ran it, and within the OECD, the most powerful country was the US. And collectively, Europe was the other most powerful area. And so they divided up the spoils and had one run the bank and one run the fund. I think that is outdated. I think it will change. I think it should change. Well, the shareholders can vote it. What Mrs. Lagarde is trying to do now is to double the number of shares and change the shareholdings and the weight and the proportion of the shareholdings. And if she succeeds in doing that, which I believe she will, then you'll have a very different weighting of the shares. And if it were to ever come to a vote, I think that, first of all, she would not be in the job, someone else would be in the job. But I personally don't think it will get to that. My own judgment is that this was the last time that the assumption was there that a US person should run the bank and a European should run the fund. There was a very strong feeling amongst the shareholders that that shouldn't happen again. And it's very strong. And I can't guarantee you that US Secretary of the Treasury, when Jim Kim resigns, the US Secretary of the Treasury won't dig his toes in and try and make sure it happens. Or that a European leader will not dig his or her toes in and make sure that happens. But I think I personally think it is unlikely. And one of the reasons that I think it is unlikely is that you know that the BRIC countries have gotten together with Russia to talk about a new institution which will, with trillions of dollars potential, will deal with financing of a series of countries in developing countries. And that was announced a little while ago. You've not had any advance in terms of how it's going to work because they're arguing about it. But I have every belief that something will emerge which will be a tool to use against the assumption in either of the institutions that the leadership should always follow that path. I think you would find inside the institutions themselves a very strong feeling that it should change, a very strong feeling. And I also think that people in the institutions know that something that was said in 1948 after World War II deserves some reassessment this period later. I personally believe it will happen.
Thank you, Jim. Just to put, I've been working on the BRICS-led Infrastructure Development Bank for just over 2 years. It was announced in the BRICS summit in Durban in March, and that work is continuing fairly rapidly. I believe it will happen, and I think that the pressure it will put on other institutions will be wholly healthy. Amartya, would you...
Excuse me,
yeah.
and is the rumour correct that you're going to be chairman of that?
No. As I learnt to say in the Majesty's Treasury, I couldn't possibly comment.
I see.
Amartya.
Well, I think this question about human rights, I think, I don't think we are really differing, but I don't believe that there's such a thing as human right to development. I think the concept of human rights isn't really like that. Human rights right from the beginning. I think there's a wonderful book on the history of it by a historian called Lynn Hunt called The Invention of Human Rights. And it's going back to the French and the American Declaration on discussions on it, including the Declaration of Fundamental Rights of human beings. And human rights is something about certain freedoms that human beings have, and along with that comes the correlate duty, what others ought to do. Not duty specific form, what Kant would call perfect obligation, but an imperfect obligation. Everyone has a duty to have. So in that context, development isn't, development is not something that happens to you or to me individually, it happens to a society. So I won't go in that direction, but human rights are very important, and your question is important, how to harmonize it. But what's the problem? The problem is there's deep inequalities in human rights. People, for example, those who have argued that liberty or human freedom is not very important have never been people who lack liberty or human freedom in their lives. But they have not been keen on other people having liberty and freedom in the same way. So I think the debate had always been in the classic territory of inequality, and then the question is equality of what? If you take somebody like, say, Marx, it's hard to think of someone who speaks as much about conflict in the context of class and so on, and also about gender in one of a few passages. In that context, but where does he go? I mean, when he's thinking of a plan for future, like the Critique of Gotha program, his last published work in 1875, he's not concerned that the conflict will stay. He's saying the conflict will disappear. And when the conflict disappears, that you might be able to have distribution according to needs, but until then you'll have need for incentives, and distribution of work would continue to be important. So it's a very practical book, but there's no presumption that you cannot overcome the conflict that exists. So I think the thing to look at are inequalities. If you take my country, and I didn't get your name, but maybe you're from South Asia, in which case it might be at least from India or close to India. You know, we have high growth rates. If you take India with Bangladesh, India was 20% higher in per capita income. Now we are 50% higher. We were 3 years ahead in life expectancy. Bangladesh is now 3 years ahead of life expectancy in India. Bangladesh has lower mortality of rates of children, has less gender differences. The female literacy has dramatically improved in Bangladesh. And the income alone didn't do it. Now, of course, Bangladesh also needs more income, and higher growth rate would be a good thing. But the human rights deserve attention, and the inequality connected with it. 30th of July last year, where half of the country, India, was plunged into darkness. 600 million people didn't have power. And people were outraged about that, and quite rightly too, because public institutions should not be run in a way that it's so fragile. But what wasn't discussed in the papers is that of the 600 million people, 200 million people had no electric connection anyway. So that we are dealing with two distinct problems. One is the deep inequality of those who have and those who haven't, whether it's power, nutrition, and that's even very basic education, basic healthcare, or, but in addition to inequality, you have the issue of organization having the delivery right, and that's where all the question of corruption and so on, which Jim has been so concerned with. And that C word comes in all kinds of ways. But corruption is not the only factor. Lack of accountability, not having a proper system. And then a misdiagnosis. You'll be often told China doesn't have this because the Chinese power sector is privatized. Well, it isn't. The Chinese power sector is exactly like in India, run by the government. But there are some private firms. But there is also in India, Tata, Reliance, etc., that provide power. I think it's that the Chinese have been consistently invested more on power than the Indians have. And the Chinese haven't had the compulsion to placate people, basically, who call themselves ordinary people, but who are actually not the poorest. The ordinary people in India is the bottom 20% of the top 20%. That is relatively better off. So you argue about having cheap diesel, where the poorest people have no instrument with which diesel could be used. You agitate about cooking gas prices being cheaper, whereas most Indians don't have any instrument into a cooking gas cylinder can go in. So I think this dialogue is very important. The way to guarantee that equity is to bring these discussions in the mainstream of public debate. India is a democracy. Why shouldn't it be able to give bigger emphasis on these rather than these relatively glitzy things on which the newspapers tend to concentrate much? I mean, Indian newspapers are a glory. The fact that India publishes more newspapers than any other country in the world by a long margin is itself a glory, but the question is how much use is being made for exactly the question you were raising, namely harmonize, I would say, make it equitable and advance on an equitable basis the fulfillment of human rights. So I think that's a very good question. I take the answer in a slightly different direction.
Thank you, Amartya. Now, before we close, can I just make 2 administrative announcements? Last year, Amartya couldn't get out of the hall, so could you make sure that you have a clear path out there for Amartya to leave? And I'm going to divide them up because Jim Wolfensohn, Sir James, is going to sign, and the books are where? Just out the back door. You will form an orderly line to get your book signed. But before you do that, I'd like you to join me in thanking 2 wonderful people on this platform. It's a real pleasure.